Hey people on the corny pipes, I'm Mr. Spork, and these are Mr. Spork's hands. It is a cold, rainy morning up here, so I'm going to make some comfort food for you in just a second. But first and foremost, more importantly, today is my mother's 85th birthday, so happy birthday to my mom. I love you dearly, Mom. She's been there for me through thick and thin, kept me out of trouble and put up with my shenanigans and let me destroy the kitchen from an early age. I know a lot about what I know about cooking from her wisdom and experience over the years. Go talk to your mom about her old recipes. They are always a treasure to rediscover if you have to. When I was talking to Mom on the phone just a few minutes ago, I told her to go get all her birthday freebies. I said, go around and get the free, when I was a kid, I used to get the free ice cream cone from the 31 Flavors people. I don't know if they still do that or not. I used to love that part. But go get your free ice cream cone and free hamburger and free steak dinner, whatever else they give to beautiful, lovely 85-year-old women on their birthdays. When I was talking to her, I was thinking back about what we always had in the pantry to eat when I was a kid growing up. And we always had polenta in the pantry. Although, living in a backwoods country town, we didn't know it was called polenta. We just knew it as cornmeal, and that's what I've got here. And in fact, polenta and cornmeal, same thing. If you go to the grocery store, to the specialty Italian section, you'll see the polenta in little tiny bags, $5 a kilo for the stuff. If you go around the corner to 2 aisles over to the baking section, you get plain old cornmeal for half or a third that price. It's the same stuff. There is some variance. You're going to see usually yellow, but sometimes you'll see white. I've even seen a wacky blue kind of cornmeal sold as a polenta mush sort of thing. But the grind is going to be a little bit different too. It's going to be very fine to very coarse. It's going to be irregular or very consistent like this stuff. They all pretty much work. But if there is a problem cooking polenta that keeps people from eating it more often, at least over in North America, it's that it takes a good 40 minutes to cook it properly. It's not cooked when you thicken it up. It thickens up in the first couple minutes, but you really do need to cook it for a good long while to get the cornmeal rehydrated. And so that's when the industry started coming up with instant polentas. And while instant polenta in a bind maybe will work, it's not my favorite on texture. I much prefer a slow-cooked polenta. But you know, a lot of times people don't have 40 minutes to spare these days, so I've got a trick for you. All you need to do, curiously enough, is pre-soak your polenta. Yes, all you got to do is pre-soak it. I've done it for as short as 30 minutes and as long as 8 hours. So whether you do it right when you come home from work before you start cooking dinner, or whether you do it in the morning before you leave, either one seems to work. The longer you soak it, the shorter the cooking time, and it kind of maxes out at about halfway. So instead of 40 minutes, you probably get it in about 20 minutes if you soaked for a couple hours. The other thing that you've got to do right when you're cooking polenta from scratch, or from quote-unquote raw, you got to make sure and get the water ratio right. 5 to 1 at minimum, and sometimes I even go to 6 to 1 depending on what I'm doing, how big a batch I'm doing. The extra, within reason, is going to evaporate as steam while you're cooking it. So you can go to 7 to 1 if you want. I wouldn't go as much as 10 to 1. That's pushing the envelope a little bit. But 5 to 1 for starters, maybe 5.5 to 1. So for one person, one average person, about 60 grams is a good portion. So I'm going to go in with 60 grams just to start today. This can easily multiply up to feed whatever crowd you got on a brunch. We're right in the middle of Easter weekend, so I suspect there are some brunches going on. 60 grams of cornmeal in there, which means I'm going to need 300 grams of water at minimum. 300 grams, 300 milliliters, same thing in the case of water. It's a density question. So there is 300, and you know, I'm going to give myself just a little bit of margin for error. I'm going to go to 325. So I got 325 grams, 325 milliliters of water, and I'm going to let this soak for at least 30 minutes, but probably more realistically like an hour, hour and a half. I'm going to go answer some emails and such. I'll be back to show you how to proceed. We're going to get some interesting stuff on top of this polenta once we cook it right. Be back in a bit. Okay, we're well into the soak, as you can see from the clock over there, but I should clarify the water that I used earlier to soak is just plain cold tap water. Don't use warm or hot there because it would tend to prematurely thicken. We don't want that to happen until we get onto the actual cooking heat. But that does bring up another question. A lot of times people will see recipes that use stock, chicken stock or vegetable stock, or sometimes even cream or milk in their polenta for the cook. And while that will work and it'll give you a much richer flavor, I'm not eating polenta because I want to hide the corn flavor. I want that corn flavor to really come through. And anytime you use those other sorts of additions for the cook, you're going to mute those flavors, those corn flavors, just a little bit. So I prefer to just use water. If you're going to try stock or cream or any other add-in, I would probably cut it with water at least by half, maybe by 2/3, something along those lines for the cook. So you get a nice clean polenta. You can stir flavors in at the end like I'm going to do today, or make it something interesting to go on top, which I'm also going to do today. You might finish it with just a little bit of butter or maybe a little bit of oil. If you're feeling particularly luxurious and you got a little bit of extra chicken fat laying around, that would work. I've seen people do it with bacon drippings. But in all cases, I would probably err to the side of caution and don't go nuts with those extra flavors if you really want it to taste like polenta. A little bit of good peppercorn, obviously fresh ground. I'm going to go ahead and grab the good French gray salt, sel gris, for making polenta today. But there are lots of other flavor permutations that you can either mix in at the end or make something to go on the top. Obviously, cheese is very popular. You see Parmesan all the time worked into it. I use a good melting cheese sometimes, like Gruyere too. Any kind of 3-cheese polenta is going to be a lovely approach. Sometimes you'll see people will go and grab something sweet. It actually does make an interesting polenta. You can do fresh cranberries with a little bit of sugar. That works really well. If you want to go a little crazy and kind of mix your cuisines a little bit, you could go with some hot chilies, or more hot chilies or less hot chilies to taste. You can even go and grab yourself a whole head of garlic and roast that garlic till it's nice and sweet and stir that in at the very end. But again, in all cases, I like to do those extra flavors at the end after I've cooked the polenta pretty much on its own. For me today, though, I'm going to show you one of my favorite combinations. I've done this for I don't know how many years. I don't know where I came up with the idea, but a little bit of mushroom, a little bit of sage, and some sun-dried tomatoes. Just a few, not many at all. I'm going to make something interesting out of the mushrooms on top, and this is really important. You can't just stir raw mushrooms into the polenta and expect it to taste very good. People that don't like mushrooms, what few of them are out there, usually don't like mushrooms because of the texture, and that's because they weren't cooked right. You've got to cook the mushrooms separately over high heat to really concentrate the flavor down. I'm going to do that for you today. I just like sage that much, and mushroom sage goes together really well. I've got a little bit of extra onion to go in there today. Normally I would use a shallot, but for some reason our shallot supply is, I don't know what's going on this month, but they're like 3 times the price. So I'm just going to use a little bit of onion. If you really wanted an extra punch, you could certainly go garlic there, but I'm trying to, again, keep it simple while I'm cooking the polenta. So I'm going to do that. And for my sun-dried tomatoes, it's not going to take many. And I should give you a little quick budget tip here. Sun-dried tomatoes pre-packed in oil are expensive. You can usually buy the dried, dehydrated sun-dried tomatoes in a little snack pack. I get like 300 grams for $3, really, really cheap, and then pack them in my oil myself. That gives me a couple choices. I can add my own flavors in here, and I can also choose the oil I want. I actually don't like olive oil in this case, because what happens is this oil is going to get flavored with the tomatoes over time. You know, these are certainly edible after a day, but they're absolutely delicious after 2 or 3 weeks of sitting there and soaking and flavoring that oil. So for that, I much prefer a neutral oil. I use canola, you can use sunflower, something like that. Olive oil seems to fight with a little bit. You also can add other flavors, a quick dash of oregano, dried oregano, or I think I do have a chopped garlic clove or 2 in there this time. The way to do those from dry, though, take the dry ones out of the package, cover them with boiling water for about a minute. This is just going to start them rehydrating. It's going to wash off anything that's left over from the factory or the farm. Drain that 1 minute boiling soaking water off, because it's going to be kind of bitter, maybe even a little bit dirty from whatever comes off the skins. And then put them back in the bowl, cover them all the way with oil, throw them in the back of your fridge, and like I say, they'll be edible the next day, but absolutely delicious after a couple weeks. And then the beautiful part is this oil becomes as valuable as the tomatoes themselves. So for my 1 person portion of 60 grams, I'm only going to use 1 tomato, just a little tiny bit, and a little bit of the oil left over. So that's where we're going with the flavors. I'm going to get started cooking here in just a second. I'm going to kind of cook backwards, and then I'm going to do the mushrooms and such that goes on top of the polenta first, because I want to cook the polenta last, so it's warm and creamy out of the pan right as it goes into my bowl. I have just committed the cardinal mushroom sin in French cooking circles. I have just washed my mushrooms. Yes, I washed them. Everybody that's ever been trained by a French kitchen general knows that you're not supposed to wash your mushrooms, right? Well, I've seen mushroom farms. They are not pretty places. They are quite dirty in corners. You definitely want to wash your mushrooms. Don't worry about it though, because as long as you don't wash them more than about a minute before they go in the pan, no harm done. What you don't want to do is wash them an hour or two or longer ahead of time, put them in something plastic, because then they really will decay and go mushy on you. But washing them right before they go in the pan, no problem. Another little trick, let me get my pan going here. Another little trick that I do when I go to cut them, basically, I want to cut them kind of like a crazy monkey. I don't want nice, even, symmetrical slices, because I'm going to get a more interesting mouthfeel and a more interesting texture by just chopping them randomly, haphazardly. Some would say like I normally chop. But those different shapes and sizes are going to give you different shapes and textures on your fork, and that's a good thing. So just chop them like a crazy person, or give your 3-year-old a big knife and let them cook them, or chop them, but don't be consistent. I do the same thing when I'm actually chopping mushrooms for my pizzas, because it gives me more interesting character on the slice. That's about right. I got 4 mushrooms. That's probably enough right there, but I love mushrooms, so I'm going to go ahead and chop all 4 of them here. I'm just using plain, ordinary button mushrooms. If I had wild mushrooms, they would be delicious. But this is what I got today, and they're nice and cheap. And as long as you cook your mushrooms properly, they will taste delicious, even the plain old button mushrooms. When you go to buy button mushrooms, if you ever see any over in the discount section that are kind of already opened up, buy them, because as the mushroom opens up, it gets more flavor. Those really tightly closed, tight-packed mushrooms that everybody thinks are perfect mushrooms, they're a little early. In fact, when I buy them like that, I usually leave them in the fridge for an extra couple days or an extra week until they do start to open up, because that's when they've got better flavor. I want to get just a little bit of this onion in there. Not much at all, but since I'm going to make kind of, in effect, a little pan sauce at the very end to go on the polenta, I want to go ahead and get some of that in there. Again, if shallots were cheap this week, I would have used them, but work with what you got, as they say. I think that's enough in there. Where's my scraper? Here we go. I do this all the time, and I know people are probably going to call me to task on it, but you're not supposed to scrape stuff off your board with your knife, because that will dull your knives. But I'm lucky I've got a really nice sharpener in the background. So my knives get abused and then treated well, both ends of the spectrum there. I'm going to take my sage, and I just want a little quick chiffonade on my sage here. You roll it up. Same thing with basil all the time. You get little tiny strips. The trick with cooking mushrooms, again, high heat, a little bit of fat in there to really truly fry them rather than steam them. You don't want steamed mushrooms. But let me grab my spatula. The real trick, if there is one to cooking mushrooms, is once you get them in the pan and you get them coated in their fat, whether you're using butter or oil, and I'm going to give them just a little extra dose of oil here, not much, that's half a teaspoon or so. Once you get them sorted in your pan, don't crowd your pan too much. This is actually probably a little bit crowded, more crowded than it should be, but we'll make do here. You want to get just a tiny little bit of salt on there. The salt will help them release their moisture. Remember, mushrooms can be up to 95% moisture. I think, generally speaking, anywhere from 85 to 95 is what you usually see. But a little bit of salt on there, and a little grind of pepper. And like I say, get them coated in that fat nicely. Not going to put the sage in yet. I don't want that to burn or brown off too much. But once you got them in the pan with a little bit of oil, now here's the trick. Watch closely. Don't touch them. If you touch this pan while they're exuding the moisture and coloring up, you're going to ruin the flavor. And in effect, you will get steamed mushrooms. So I'm not going to touch this pan again until I can smell the mushrooms. Once I can smell them, then I can go in and flip them and turn them and move around, all that sort of thing. So give them just probably a minute or two to color up on one side. I'll be back when I can smell them. If you happen to be making polenta for brunch, it's a lovely thing for brunch because it's just kind of halfway between a side dish and entree. Add an egg, add a poached egg. If you want to go old school and swirl the water and put some vinegar in the water and poach the egg old school, that will work, although I've never been able to do it very well. I went and got these little silicone egg poachers. Modern science to the rescue. I think I got 4 of them for $5, and they work really, really well. And I've seen them in all the usual suspects, all different kinds of brands. But poach an egg to go on top of your polenta. Your mushrooms on top of that will be an absolute delicious thing for your breakfast, brunch, lunch, dinner, whatever you're going to do with. I still can't quite smell them, so I'm going to leave them alone for another 30 seconds or a minute. Okay, I can smell them. We're there, I think. And I'll tell you real quick in a second. Yep, see that color, that golden color on the bottom? That is exactly what you want for maximum mushroom flavor. Don't be afraid of a little few charred edges. We have driven the moisture off, and that's what's going to give us a gorgeous flavor. Just going to give them a quick turn, get them on the other side, spread them back out. We'll let them go for probably a minute or so more here, and we're going to finish this as a pan sauce after the polenta's cooked. So give them another minute or so. We'll get on to cooking polenta. I do want to get just a little bit of seasoning in the actual cooking water, but not crazy. The corn can certainly take a good dose of it, but we've of course got salt in the mushrooms as well, so it's less than a quarter teaspoon probably in there. And I'm going to bring it up on a reasonably high heat. I'm going to go, well, probably 5 or 6. But critically, the bulk of the cooking time, you know, out of the 20 minutes it's going to take to cook, I'm going to probably leave 15 minutes of that cooking on the lowest possible setting, just stirring occasionally. Now, I know a lot of times you've probably heard the old rule that you're supposed to pour the fresh polenta or the dry polenta into rapidly boiling water, whisking it all the while. And you know, that does work, but it's absolutely not necessary. I think maybe that tip got some traction back when the instant polentas came around, because you really do need to stir it like crazy when you're doing instant polenta, since it cooks just almost instantly. But when you're doing this from raw, even if you don't cold soak beforehand, even if you're just cooking straight, you know, the 40-minute method, it's okay just to stir it every now and then. You don't have to go crazy with stirring it constantly. Every 2 or 3 minutes is fine. What we're going for here is the what I call the gloop gloop stage, and that means we want it to be thick enough to make the gloop gloop noises in the bubbles on the top. And that's only going to take 2 or 3 minutes, but where people go wrong is they think once it gets to that thickness that it's done and you're done cooking it. By far and away, you are not even close to done cooking. You need to continue to cook it for 40 minutes in the case of unpre-soaked, or 20 minutes in the case of soaked probably, to get that creaminess, that texture. Even if you're not using dairy, you're going to get a creamy character out of polenta when it's low, slow cooked. All right, so we're not still too thin. We're not going to turn the heat down. Once we get to the gloop gloop stage, that's when you really knock the temperature down for the rest of the boil. We're talking the lowest possible setting on my little burner here. Almost there, just watching the bubbles. Gets a little messy at this point, and you do have to stir a little more regularly here at the start over the high heat, but I think we're there. Okay, so now, gloop gloop, we're going to knock the temperature all the way down to 1 out of 6. Give it a good solid stir out of the corners, and now, just to conserve that liquid that we've got in there for the first few minutes, for the first couple rounds, first couple cycles of stir, I'm going to leave the lid on. So I'll be back in about 3 minutes to give it a stir and check on the liquid. Okay, 3 minutes into it. I'm going to drain some of that moisture that's accumulated on the lid back down into it. Give it a good stir. Yes, it's going to stick a little bit on the bottom, but it's going to come right back with a good stir and a good stiff whisk. I've also discovered that if any does stick at the end, a soak in the dish sink will get any old polenta off the bottom of your pots real easily. Just give it an hour or so soaking and it cleans right up. That's it for another 3 or 4 minute cycle. I think for the second time I'm going to go ahead and leave the lid on one more time. Let's see how we're doing in there. Coming along nicely, just barely ticking over. That's what we want. I'm going to go ahead and leave the lid off now for the rest of the duration. What I'm really looking at is the finished texture. You want to try to get it as smooth as possible. Of course, it's going to be a little bit grainy just because it's polenta, but you will see a noticeable difference in the texture. And of course, if you grab a tasting spoon, I've got one over here, you can taste it as you go along and see where you are on the texture. Yeah, coming along nicely. I'm going to go ahead and enrich it just a little bit Get just a tiny little bit of butter in there at the midpoint. Maybe even a quick dose of oil. Also checking for salt there. I think we're okay, but adjust to preference. I know the temptation here is to go ahead and dump in some different flavors, but trust me when I tell you, you're going to like it better stirred in at the very end. I think what happens is when you cook interesting flavors into it, it turns into some of the ugliest mush you've ever seen too. So save that for the very end. But I'm watching the texture here. Going to keep doing this, tinning this every couple minutes. And also I should say, if for whatever reason, maybe the grind or the style of polenta you've got in your local grocery store, you may need to adjust the water just a little bit. Don't go dumping in another cup, but a couple spoonfuls here and there just to loosen it up to work is certainly okay. I don't need any right here. This is right about where I want it. So I'm going to keep cooking a bit longer. Okay, we are rapidly approaching the 20-minute mark, which means we've just about got polenta done. Right where I want it. Again, tasting for consistency more than anything. Oh yeah, there's definitely a change in the creaminess quotient, if you want to call it that. Don't need any extra water, so we're okay there. I think that is just about perfect. Let me grab a couple other ingredients. Got just a little bit of stock and a little bit of lemon juice for finishing the sauce, the mushrooms that we made earlier. But now I'm going to go ahead and call that done. I don't know exactly how long it's been, but that's probably 20 minutes. Pull this off. And now that we're off heat, I'm going to go ahead and let me go grab the mushrooms real fast. I want to bring them back up to temperature, not going crazy on heat, probably a 2 out of 6 there, just to gently warm them back up. Yeah, let's go ahead and go 3 out of 6. And now I can go ahead and stir in some flavors. So I'm going to go in with my sun-dried tomatoes. I think the little tiny bit of acidity they add really lightens up the polenta. Stir them around gently so we don't get something too ugly. And I need to go grab myself a warmed serving bowl. Please be sure to put hot food on hot plates. Keep cold food on cold plates. You don't want beautifully hot prepared food landing on a cold plate and losing 30 degrees instantly. Nice and smoothie, just horrible. That's just I don't know if you can tell there. That's just where I want it. Like it a little thinner, a little bit more water. Like it a little thicker, cook it a little longer. That's perfect there. These are coming back up to temperature. So that last little bit of butter, I think I started, by the way, with like 20 grams of butter, as much or as little as you want, but it doesn't take half a pound to make things delicious here. Remember, I had a little extra oil squirted into the polenta, and I also had a little oil from the tomatoes themselves. Those are, if you're counting fat calories, which I never do anyway. So I want to brighten it up. This is, that's a teaspoon of fresh lemon juice and just a little bit of stock. This is probably a tablespoon or so. I just want to basically deglaze that pan. Make a little bit of a sauce there, but not much at all. We're okay on salt there. Just going to give it a little extra pepper. And now, right at the very end, I'm going to go ahead and put in most of my sage. I'm going to save just a little bit for garnish. Stir that in, give the sage some contact with that oil to really bring out the flavor and the aroma. And barely a pan sauce. I mean, there's just barely any sauce there at all. That's okay. And I'm going to go straight on top of my polenta here. This would be, again, a great place to put a poached egg if you want to really bulk it up with the protein. This whole thing's really cheap too, by the way. I haven't done the exact food costing on it, but this can't be more than $1 worth. So there you go, my friends. Polenta with mushrooms, sage, and sun-dried tomatoes. It is absolutely delicious. Trust me, I've made 1,000 bowls of this. I do hope you try something like this at home. Polenta flavored any way you want is easy to make if you just follow a couple simple rules to get that cornmeal hydrated properly. I thank you for liking and thumbs upping and tweety, facey spacing and all that other crazy social media stuff. If you haven't, please do hit the subscribe button because we YouTubers need those subscriber numbers these days to stay in the loop. And as always, if you can take a few seconds to watch the ad that runs after this, I'd greatly appreciate it because whoever they are, they throw a few pennies in my pocket. That keeps me in mushrooms and polenta. Until next time, I'm Mr. Spork. These are Mr. Spork's hands. Now go make yourself some corny goodness. Cheers.